The autotypical definition of the word recovery is, quote, to be restored to normal health. The first consideration that arises out of that statement is what is normal? Whatever normal is, as we like to say. Well, I did some research and discovered that normal is described in the Dictionary of Psychology as the absence of abnormality. Of course, we do end up in the same conundrum yet again, whatever abnormality is. But we might say that abnormality is anything outside of a flourishing parameter. So anything that isn't within usual functioning. Yet, of course, usual functioning, somewhat lofty term, proposes that there is a way, or one way, that things ought to, or generally are. But perhaps then usual functioning is the common experience. For example, the common experience of the sun is light and heat. For example, the common experience of a human being is generally a body, generally consciousness inside of which the idea of a body rises. And then there are, of course, cultural and social and familial norms that we are conditioned to adhere to. So there are ways in which we can step outside of that. Now, of course, we ought to champion the unorthodox, what we usually call weird or strange, when we don't have access to the idea that actually is on the edge of normality, where greatness and also madness can occur. So to recover through ideas of what that means in our general medical or clinical culture is to be put into society in a way which sees us move around a life and navigate a set of circumstances, experiences, people, places and things, which sees us happy, functioning and exercising what we would usually call our will on how we would like to live our life. Of course, there are inalienable limits to doing so, because of course we don't like the outliers, we're uncomfortable with difference, we marginalise the poor, the addicted, the broken, the strange, the weird, the unorthodox. Yet, in a robust society, certainly in Western cultures, there is an attempt to support, to enable and navigate that. And of course, human parameters, even whether cultural or familial or societal, or the world's idea of what normal should be, is constantly in flux and mute. As we see now with our gender descriptions and the movement that's happening around how we identify ourselves as persons and the way we would like that to be expressed. There's some fantastic stuff happening. It's really exciting the way in which humanity is evolving. It's good stuff. But this word recovery generally suggests through clinical and medical means that we have been through a condition, or we have experienced a condition which sees us be restored to normal health. The way I would describe it is to move from a consciousness of one type and to arrive or appear in a consciousness of another type. Perhaps the initial consciousness or the initial way of being is a sickness, an illness, a diagnosis, these kind of medical and clinical labels. And we receive a treatment and we recover from the condition. There are no conditions or diagnoses or labels that we can be given or give ourselves in self-diagnosis in which we are doomed to never recover. There are some around mental health in which we are considered to be recovering, but the intention here is to look at what that means, where that comes from and why that is the case, and even if it's true. So for example, recovery is a term in the UK at least, in social care circles. I think this is the same in a lot of so-called Western countries, whatever the West is. West of the map, of course. And, you know, there are resources, strategies, programs, practices, applications of tools. There are teachers, there are experts, there are therapists, psychologists, sociologists, doctors, consultants, psychiatrists, all kinds of clinical, medical and social care workers who are able to offer the latest or the most established or the most impactful strategies, tools and resources in order to bring about recovery or to enable a restoration to normal health or usual parameters for living within the society around here, of course, arguably. Let's leave that open. And so recovery tends to be a word used in those forums, in those tribes, in those communities, through those organisations, through those health systems and health services. Primarily, individuals with mental health diagnosis, people with addictions is one of those, people with bipolar disorder, with sociopathies, with psychopathies, with personality disorders, with labels, with phobias, people that have received diagnosis for difficulties and conditions and responses and attitudes and behaviours and ways of living in the world that don't fit the usual parameters, usually encounter the desire to recover or need to recover, or health professionals that would like them to recover, despite the idea of whether they're happy making the choices that they make or not. One of the paradigms that stems out of this that I've often encountered professionally is the idea of having capacity, that is, the mental capacity to be able to make the choices that the person is making. You know, do they respond to the questions asked with an answer that clearly makes sense to them, even if it doesn't fit the idea of what a healthy answer would be. A really good example are people with drug and alcohol problems, overeaters, undereaters, overachievers, underachievers. You know, are they making the choice to give their money away to other people that one might be concerned are financially abusing the vulnerable person? Are they complicit, or are they in charge enough of their decision-making processes to be asked to give their money away when their money arrives on a payment date, and to make that decision to do so, to say, yes, here's all of my money, as you've kindly offered to help me with it, from a seemingly rational place, though the activity itself might seem, in an umbrella term, irrational, completely irrational, and actually destructive and abusive, and an act of self-neglect. Do they have the capacity to make their own decisions? And often this is the case. We would like people to make decisions that we would like them to make. And of course, we all make our own decisions. But their capacity is a notion that enables us to protect somewhat those who do lose the capacity to make choices from their best thinking, their best feeling and their best way of being in the world as they are, given that they have a specific diagnosis. And then, of course, if we look at drug dependency or alcohol dependency, same thing, substance misuse. Individuals that have become very unwell from compulsive habits around drugs, alcohol, food, codependent relationships, gambling, pornography, anything that we can develop an unhealthy attachment towards and become enslaved to compulsive relationship to that attachment. So the primary relationship in the life of the addicted or the attached is to the object of fixture and fascination. So we become excited by the sensations brought about in the body from cocaine or heroin or overeating or undereating or gambling or pornography or sexual abuse. And that becomes the primary way in which we find comfort, safety and security in the world. It becomes, if we really look at it, the way in which we become present to the world, and we are brought out of the mental narrative that is where we experience mental unwellness, where our mental health suffers, where our thought life, our mental narrative is the dominant expression, and we need a respite from that. We all do this. Some of us have a glass of wine, some of us get home and watch TV, some of us numb down with food, some of us purge our food in the bathroom after we've eaten it. Some of us engage in healthy, unhealthy relationships. Some of us engage in extramarital relationships. But all of these are relationships in the end. They are relationships with an object or an external factor to bring about fluid feelings on the inside in order to feel a sense of temporary safety and security and comfort, or just to switch off the thought life for a few hours a day. And then, of course, we repeat the cycle again. The nature of the word addiction stems from the phrase to redo. So we simply redo each day. And perhaps this becomes such a destructive force in a person's life that the idea that they may need to recover or to undertake a process of recovery comes about. Of course, recovery isn't all chronic in this way. You know, we'll all go into a hospital where we'll all have operations, or we'll all go through ill health in a way which sees us need to recover, in a way which sees us be for a short time in recovery. Some of us have been taught to describe ourselves as being in recovery eternally. And there's argument about that, there's discussion about that. I don't mean there's a fight about that, though sometimes there is a fight about that from those that wish to defend a label that they keep. And find that a compelling way of describing how they're experiencing their new way of life. We generally find this to be the most dominant around people with substance misuse issues that may have been brought through a process or use a process or identify with a community or a tribe or a way of living that sees them describe themselves as a recovering addict or alcoholic or a recovering compulsive overeater. And then this has seeped into our lay narrative of people who describe themselves as recovering Catholics and recovering psychologists and recovering parents and recovering children, and all kinds of ways in which we use this label to describe ourselves as in a different consciousness to the preceding consciousness. Again, drug addiction's just a superb example, so let's use that one. So we identify ourselves as a drug addict and we have no recovery, and achieve not only a state of abstinence, because not having drugs when a drug addict isn't recovery, it's simply, perhaps for many, the absence of the substance to which we're dependent. This can often happen between people's capacity to find and source money, even if that money comes from the government. Not using drugs in between governmental payments because a person has no money isn't recovery. It's simply, we might call it abstinence. Is it sober? It might be sober from the substance, but it's not emotionally sober, mentally sober. It's not sobriety. It might be sober, but it's not sobriety. That is another state of consciousness, another shift, another movement. Similarly, recovery is not simply the lack of access to drugs or alcohol or food, because a person who is starving themselves to death slowly isn't in recovery from food. Their unhealthy attachment is to the absence of food. So that to them would be using. The using and the sensation brought about by using, the neurological response, the activity of dopamine, acetylcholine, GABA, serotonin, and the other one that I can't remember, I might remember in a moment. So the neurological activity, which is the compelling biological feature of all addiction, the movement of synapse activity in the brain, is the response that people want, because it brings about fluid feelings, or it brings about that sense of numbness, it brings about that sense of a feeling other than the feeling I had before. And there is some truth in the idea that we wish to escape the feeling we're having, and any other feeling will do. Or when we become overwhelmed by that sensation and the neurons, and cocaine is a really good example, or anyone who's recovered from cocaine use, that it takes time for those neurons to diminish in their reactivity, even after, I don't simply mean between cocaine binges or between 1 ounce or the next ounce if you're super rich, or 1 gram and the next gram, or 1 line and the next line, but periods of enforced, maybe we're imprisoned or arrested for some drug-related crime, but not everyone who takes drugs is a criminal. But maybe there's a period where we don't have access to the substance, and the neurons really do keep firing with cocaine, and it can take time. Barely when people are still in the inward cycle and still looking out to the world through the same consciousness of the cocaine user, they don't get sufficient time between using in order to be set free from that neurological activity, the psychological activity, the behavioural attachment that comes with addiction that we also need to recover from. That is cooking up the heroin and rolling up the joint, kneading the bread, cooking the pasta, restricting the food. You know, there's so many complex factors. The behavioural complexity of addiction, making the thing, preparing the thing, is such a compelling feature that individuals that are IV drug users might inject water when there's no drugs, just for the sensation of putting a needle in the arm, as needle fixation. Nonetheless, this is the whole gamut of the active addict, or the ways in which the person's condition is expressed that they desire to recover from. And so they are brought to their knees by this. We end up in a place of absolute suffering, terrible place to be, and desire to recover. And maybe we are one of the blessed ones, or the lucky ones, or those that appear to be chosen, or those that like to congratulate themselves on the active agency of bringing about recovery on their own resources. Whatever method is not really for discussion here. But the person then moves into a state, a way of being, other than that which they were in when they were unwell or ill or sick, bearing in mind that mental health diagnosis, governed by the World Health Organization and our medical model in the UK and other medical models in other medical countries, addiction is categorized as a mental health diagnosis, but there's a whole spectrum of those, from bipolar, as we've said, to sociopathy, to personality disorders, to addictions, to anxiety disorders, which are distinct from mental health diagnosis. But these kind of labels that we have, and some of us give to ourselves without ever having a clinical diagnosis or undertaking any assessment with which to get a diagnosis. Why would we do that? Some people, when they have a label to call themselves, for example, I've worked with a young man who was very confused by the world, as young men often are. It's not a diagnosis, it's often just being a young male without appropriate guidance, without having a teacher or enough masculine and feminine energy in our lives, that we are able to find a way of being that enables us to fit in with our environment and our surroundings and the relationship that make that up. So life is very confusing for the teen. For the teen is, as I've said elsewhere, being a teenager is a path that it sometimes seems that we have to spend the rest of our lives figuring out what the hell went on there. So we need to look after our youngers and allow them to be young, but enable them and guide them through that. I worked with a young man who gave himself a diagnosis of personality disorder that enabled him to find liberation from the experiences he was going through, which were on a spectrum between acting out sexually across genders in a way which was also exploration and absolutely, I suppose, compelling and fine on some level, though he may have put himself in dangerous situations, between that kind of acting out or exploration, and that of arson, starting a fire. But once he found this label of personality disorder, once he was able to identify with that label, whether true or not, he found liberation from his behavioural responses. That's a form of recovery then, having a label, to be moved from one consciousness to another, one way of seeing ourselves to another, one state of being to a state of being that sees us able to adapt and develop resilience and respond and be okay and live instead of feel instead of feeling trapped by life. Trapped by life in a way where the word life is a challenge for us and all that brings with it to us, but for life to be put into bold capital letters and to feel invigorated, inspired and excited by it, to move out of the maladjustment and into an adjustment that sees us feel happy, sometimes joyous and foundationally free. Even when we go through experiences which don't feel like freedom, we still know there's a bigger story. There's a really good definition of recovery, what it feels like, what the experience of having recovered, there it is, past tense, from whatever it is, whatever label we've had or have. So now this word appears. So there is, should we go for an operation of period of being in recovery? We might go and visit a relative. We might come out of a period of recovery after an operation to be told that we were in recovery. I myself have been in a coma for 6 nights, blackness, no thought, no dream, no person, no Billy, just nothing. And, coming out of that, waking up in intensive care to this kind of experience of where am I, and then beginning to start rapping. Rather strange. Trust me, you've only got to look at me to know I'm not historically known as a rapper, though I've tried in quiet. To be told that I was in recovery. But as I was recovering for a season after that, which was a process for me at that time, which I would say took 3, maybe 4 years, long time recovering from terrific injuries that I'd sustained when I was hit by a car on the pavement. Another story, another recording. Because for me, the recovering was the emotional recovery, the move towards being emotionally resilient. Again, all those things I've just described, to be purposeful again in the world and to come to an experience of feeling whole. How did that feeling of wholeness manifest? What did that feel like? What did that look like? On any given day, it was simply the next prosaic, regular, normal thought that appeared. And it appeared in the simple phrase, "Oh, I'm happy." We often miss the God of small things. We look for great, vast spiritual experience, emotional experiences, peak experiences, evocative experiences, the enlightenment experience. The lights are on. Learning how to read and navigate the ordinary world is truly the mark of innate and given wisdom, not learned wisdom. We learn knowledge. Wisdom is an experience that information, knowing, being, sensing, offering, giving, and loving has been offered to us and is an outward pouring. We don't covet wisdom and those ways in which I described it. It is given to us. We can't learn it. There isn't a way to achieve it by works and deeds. As Oscar Wilde said so beautifully, wisdom comes with winters. That's just such a beautiful phrase, the idea that the longer we're here, and I would say the more encounters we have with the inherent and essential suffering of life. That's not to say we go out and we look for suffering, but life is difficult, life is suffering. We know this from our traditions and our wisdom traditions. And in embodying that suffering and allowing ourselves to be transformed, in recovering for a period from that suffering and knowing the experience of having recovered from the suffering that we went through, the difficult seasons of life. You know the ones, you may be in the ones. We all know difficulty. Once we've embodied that and we're able to find the inherent lessons that stem from that, then we have recovered. This phrase that we have that we're recovering from something actually stems from the same principle that mental health diagnoses, all of them, most of them, are manageable with medication, strategies, tools, CBT, therapy, antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, behavioural modulating medications like olanzapine, I'm waiting for the word, those which are for more serious mental health diagnosis like bipolar, like personality disorder. Maybe the word will come in a second, but those of you that know will know the ones. Lithium, there's another one, so olanzapine, lithium, those type of things, as opposed to SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors for depressive state. I'm not sure where I was going with that or where I was before that. So I'll just keep talking and then a thread will come back to me that may be different to the one that I was saying before. It's fine. Let's see where we go. It may or may not be interesting. So, so we can manage a mental health diagnosis with medications, talking and strategies. But we can never fully recover from these labels. This is where our understanding of addiction initially went awry, because addiction being labelled as a mental health diagnosis, and rightly so, there's a mental component, there's a physical component, the detox, the neurological responses. There's the psychological component, it's the mental one, the cognition and the attitudes and behaviours that are really where addiction is. And then there's the emotional and environmental, there's the upbringing and the trauma and the introverted ways in which we've shut down the unfinished business that we're stuck at in some place that we need to talk through and feel in a safe environment. And there's a holistic model and the emotional congruence that we need to learn in order to develop the necessary resilience to recover. And that emotional incongruity, where that we are trapped at old stuff and attitudes and mechanisms and acting out and our reactive responses to the outside world and the people, places and things within it that see us fall back into unhealthy patterns and compulsive behaviours and attitudes, that see relapse, which is another term similar to recovery, relapse in the attitudes and behaviours that precede picking up the first one of the objects of attachment. So there's a really interesting point there about addictions and attachments, in that way that whilst we as a world community categorise addiction as an activity based on the inability to stop, we've gone awry there. If we really look at the individual's inability to not start again, so setting aside the idea that addiction is a behaviour or an activity that we can't stop, we look at, because there will be there, the person's historic pattern with periods where they did stop. Maybe they were arrested, maybe they were hospitalised, maybe they had a period of recovery, and the label recovery kept them attached to the idea of being a drug user. But now I'm a non-drug user. My name's Billy, I'm an addict. My name's Billy, I'm a drug addict. So I'm either using or I'm not using, but either way I'm Billy, and I have a relationship to drugs, whether it's an active relationship or an absent relationship, but I'm still the same person, I'm still the same personality, and therein lies some of the problem, that we never really recover from the personality concept or the self concept to which our real attachment belongs, which we should move on to. But whether we are in recovery or recovering or have recovered, this personality that we are, that we take ourselves to be, is where the real root of the problem lay, and where the real root of the solution lay that we recover from. So we measure addiction as an activity of not being able to stop. But in fact, if we really look at our patterns and our periods of why we started again, what we may discover is we had no specific reason for starting again. We may have a rationale. Someone died, I was ill, my benefit check didn't come, I got fired, my relationship broke down, one of my children died. Any story that we can tell ourselves on why we began, or why we returned, or why we newly started that unhealthy behaviour, whether substance, person, place, food or activity, started again. We may have a story, but actually in the light of the madness that ensues as a result of that, there isn't a sufficient story for starting again. What we find is relapse, in which we might lose recovery, or we are no longer recovering, we're back in active compulsion or active addiction, is a condition characterized by that relationship, and that the relapse started months, years, or even immediately after we last used. But the nature of that personality attachment, the nature of the attachment to the identity that we've given ourselves, and in particular in some cases, the attachment to me as a person in recovery as opposed to me as an active addict, is the problem. The problem that we persist in this idea that I am a person who is in recovery can be our very downfall, because we never really set ourselves free from the idea of this personality who has a relationship to drugs, be it they're in my hand or be it their very absence. And I haven't had them for years. I'm 50 years sober. I'm 1,000 years clean. I'm 100 days from last compulsively overeating. I haven't watched pornography or masturbated for 1,000,000 years. Whatever it is, it's still a relationship to the object. But the problem is the relationship of the personality that has the relationship to the object or its absence. If we look at why we start again, we can see that having had that attachment, that very attachment to that personality has led us back to a place where when life deals us a bitter blow, we just simply start again for no apparent reason. And that is a very helpful diagnosis of the nature of addiction anyway. We don't really need a reason at the end of the day. It just becomes the next right thing. But a long way off, we've cognitively fallen into an understanding of ourselves and our place in the world that has kept that idea on the back burner, and we're gone again. And the arrogance of the cognition of those with unhealthy attachments in that way is that when there's a point of picking up a substance, person, food, behaviour, attitude or activity again, the simple rationalising thought will occur that, well, I can just do recovery again. And of course what happens is people don't, they die. Perhaps their substance addiction is to heroin or crack cocaine or meth or whatever. But those are sufficiently hard on the physical body that people overdose, they have a heart attack, or end up in a state of psychosis that they never return from. Yet, again, that's to describe relapse out of recovery. And that relapse doesn't happen between times when we have money, because we're not relapsing from anything at that point. Periods between paydays or cocaine days or heroin days or pornography days or visits to Thailand days, however the attachment manifests. Periods of no money means no object of fixture and fascination. Doesn't mean recovery, it just means not having the money to use. But that's great news, it's really exciting news, because then we're not relapsing from anything. You haven't relapsed, it isn't a relapse. It's the same consciousness with which I last used, waiting, same consciousness, and then I next used. That isn't a recovery, that isn't a loss of anything, it's the same. And we do people an injustice when we teach them that periods of not being able to use because they don't have the sufficient resources is recovery. It's just not fair on them, because it proposes then a cyclic pattern, a revolving door of now I've relapsed. That's not relapse. Relapse is to move back from a consciousness of having recovered, or at least being in a period, which they are just periods of recovering, into activity or the behaviour, attitude or use of substance. So how do we come to a place where we experience this idea that we have recovered? Yes, those of you that are recovering, this is an experience. Arguably, you've been sold a bit of a doozy that you have to stick with this label. Let me qualify that evocative statement. I'm not talking about tribal understanding. This group consider themselves recovered. We consider ourselves recovering. You know, that kind of low level, I'm going to call it low level, tribal consciousness doesn't do anyone any justice. We all know that people recover, whether it's from mental health, whether it's from substance misuse, whether it's from being a Catholic, whether it's from our last marriage, whether it's from illness, or whether it's from having an operation and being in a period of recovery. We all know that this happens in different ways for different people. So open your mind up. There are tribal consciousness and a tribal view of things is unevolved. It's frankly unevolved. We have to know that no one group or tribe has absolute truth, and we are all one tribe, and all single groups have partial truth. Truth is available to each person as they perceive it based on where they're at. We do, after all, see things not as they are, we see things as we are. How do I say that in its cooler way? We don't see things, I don't know, I can't remember, there's a better way of saying that, but it's a cute phrase, and it's true, it's just true. How do we recover? How do we come to an experience of having recovered? Well, I've alluded to it already. So to fully recover, to embrace and know and understand and experience enduring emotional sobriety, is to move from active addiction into a place of being sober, that is removing ourselves from the substance. If we do that in our home and we carry on about our business and we get through the next payday without engaging in the behaviour, then we are sober, of course. But I wouldn't call this recovery yet, and we'll see why. Maybe we've been detoxed, or maybe we've been institutionalised, or maybe we've gone on retreat, or maybe we've moved. That can work, though I wouldn't recommend it as a design for living, as a process of recovery, just changing your postcode, because it doesn't tend to change the inner world. Excuse me. So we've stopped using, we've stopped acting out, we've stopped buying, we've stopped shopping, we've stopped watching pornography, or with other mental health diagnoses, we are stable on our medication and we're feeling fluid and purposeful when we're working and we're earning, and nothing about our life suggests to anyone else that we're living with a condition, though we do have our support structure and our safe places and the people that love and care about us. Well, we've stopped being unwell. We wouldn't call ourselves unwell. We might routinely and shamefully describe ourselves as being sick, or, you know, I'm not well, me, but, you know, that's another mechanism that is a sign that we don't yet know emotional sobriety and that we haven't recovered, that our self-talk is still very damning and very self-perpetuating of this attitude that I am bad, not ill. It's a really important stipulation. There's a difference between sickness and badness. One is a moral issue, of course, and the other one is to have a diagnosis. You know, we are not bad people trying to be good in this world. We are spiritually poor, emotionally, mentally poor people trying to become well. Let's get that right. The stigma around addiction and mental health still sees illness as inconvenient, uncomfortable, objectionable, and a moral issue. This is the predicament we still live with today, that we don't like to be around ugliness and brokenness. Some of us are okay with that. Now, those of us that have overcome, those of us that are compassionate enough not to see things in that way, these are the people that work in our hospitals and our institutions and They work in social care and in places where we're looking after the less fortunate. We are loving the outsider. We are, if you really look at things throughout the ages, we are those in the monasteries kissing the visiting lepers. And that happened, and people had their leprosy kissed. Such was the faith of some of these ancient monastics that they loved the most arrant outsiders. And of course we get that today, you know, that there's a difference between being a Christian and those that are Christ-like. I've met so many Christ-like characters that would go ballistic if they heard me call them Christ-like, because of the stigma and the poor job we've done sometimes done around our expression of how we see and experience and understand God through certain faith groups and the religiosity of those. But I've worked with some compelling characters that are so Christ-like in their ability to stand by the vulnerability of others, to look into the face of the suffering of others and groups of others in institutions and offer love, that by their very nature, by their very way of being. Compelling characters to be around and inspiring types. The way in which we are able to move through active addiction, not being able to get or have the object of fixture and fascination, to being sober, to moving into recovery, perhaps with detox and such as we've seen. Perhaps our medication is just right, or it's a good medication, it's a new medication, or perhaps there's just nothing and we're doing well and life has fallen into place again, but we're still quite delicate and vulnerable and exposed to relapse. And we would say we were in recovery, and there's a period of recovering where we heal emotionally, we heal psychologically, we heal spiritually or in our feeling spectrum. Our bodies restore themselves. We exercise, and we don't over-exercise because that's another addiction. We feed our body with nutrition. Perhaps we get some psychological and emotional support. Perhaps we even use some antidepressants to get through some of the mood states or to help us in times of extreme difficulty, which, when used properly, those medications can be good for, though there's not a lot of clinical evidence that supports that, but a lot of compelling evidence that sells a lot of those medications through general practitioners because it's financially viable, you know, without getting into the manufacturers of medicines and all of that sketchy business. But regardless, perhaps we're in a period of recovering and we feel like we're in recovery. Now, to recover for good and all, we might come to a place where we simply, as I said before, that happened to me, I realised I was happy 5 years after the event and the descent into the dark night of the soul that took me, you know, that I knew I had to go through at the beginning because I'd been exposed to enough wisdom prior to being hit by a car, waking up in intensive care, going through very elongated difficulties with morphine afterwards, coming through that, detoxing, doing a lot of therapy, you know, this whole period of recovering and having to do the work, knowing I had to do the work, knowing I had to feel what needed to be felt, knowing I had to rage where there was rage, or else bring it with me, knowing that I had to weep where I had to weep, and lots of acting out and all of that pain and trauma spilling out into the lives of those that mattered and the lives of those that didn't matter, and putting that right much later in a way that finally built on itself, that all this recovering went on. But finally there was a simple thought that was the symbol for having recovered, and that was simply the thought that I'm happy. And that wasn't I felt happy, that was I am happy right here, right now. I am present. From where I'm sitting, I was 10 feet away. I was just outside my apartment. So it's nice to know that, feel that, experience that once again. Now, it isn't as simple as that. It's an understanding of what I'd recovered from. I hadn't recovered from the substance. I hadn't had the substances for years. I hadn't recovered from the experience in this case. There's not recovery from the experiences. Those are in the past now. What had I recovered from? I recovered from the personality or the way of looking at life or the consciousness of the person who used to need those things, or the person who identified as, my name's Will and I got run over, which was a process I went through as well for a long, long time. Everyone I'd meet would go, oh, hello, Will, nice to meet you. Hello, Dave, nice to meet you. What do you do? You know, the kind of general chit-chat. I would very quickly say, I got run over, because I was identified in the role of Will as the person who got run over, or Billy, I got run over. It was a label, it was a name I had for a while, a period of still being unwell, really. To recover from that was to say, oh, my name's Will and I like cooking and I go to work and I work here, and describe myself in other ways. We begin to lose the trump card that we keep laying down in the lives of others in order to feel visible. So we might say, my name's Will and I was sexually abused as a child. My name's Will and my mother died as a child. My name's Will and I'm an overeater. My name's Will and I'm in recovery. You know, we keep laying down a trump card as a way of describing who we are in our personality. And this is key. It is that personality that we finally recover from, when we no longer have to identify ourselves as someone with a specific label. Even if we do have a mental health diagnosis that we feel like we wouldn't recover from, or we are comfortable with the idea of having that label because it does give us a sense of purpose and identity that we're comfortable with, that has set us free from being in the more chronic outpouring of that particular behaviour. Maybe we've got bipolar disorder and for a long time we've characterised ourselves by the lows and the highs that we have. But having not had those due to the right medication for a long time, we don't really identify with the highs and the lows. We're just identifying the here and now as a person, being present to the experience of another person, place or thing. We don't define ourselves by the labels we've got and we've given. To be in that place is to have recovered. Even if we're in a recovering community around substance use or overeating or gambling or pornography or sex addiction, any of those things, even if we're in a community that is precious about their labels and we want to keep them, are we still describing ourselves as someone who belongs to that community? Do we hold on to our identity as the person that belongs to that tribe? Are we at the tribal level? Are we trapped in the, are we stuck in there, or are we comfortable even in the label that we give ourselves? Well, even though I don't describe myself in that way to other people, I still know that my name is Will and I'm a recovering addict. That's fine, you do you. I'm just saying and offering the idea forward here that you might want to entertain that there is more. There's something after that, over that, or before that is absolutely real. It is absolutely possible. It's absolutely worth exploring. You might have an opinion about it. And an opinion about something we've never experienced is to offer contempt prior to investigation. If we have a negative view of something we've got no experience of, that is contempt prior to investigation. So investigate it before you dismiss it. Do that with everything. To have access to the wisdom to be available to explore things for yourself before offering an opinion forward, that is to have recovered. And that's enough.